If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Today, I'll propose that we talk about email and communication metaphors. You're not going to be shocked when I tell you that we don't handle email terribly well. And I don't mean that we don't know how to use the app that produces email, or we don't know how to type or whatever. And that may be true, but that's not really the problem. That's pretty straightforward, and there's training available on that. And I'm also not arguing at present that we don't know how to deal with emails as items of information, although I believe that's mostly true as well. That's also a different subject. We know that email is important because Cal Newport wrote a whole book on it. His title is A World Without Email. And his point is different from mine, but that's another indication that we're still struggling with email, and I would argue with other modern communication channels. My concern is whether or not we deliver our information, whether we deliver our message well on our communication channels. And I don't think we do a great job here. I think the reason that we don't do a great job is our metaphors. I think our metaphors contribute to the challenge that we face. So I believe that changing our metaphor will help us solve the problem. So I'll address some reasons for that apply to lots of modern communication channels. And I'll have some thoughts on what we can do about that. But at the core, I think if we understand the properties of the tool better, then we can learn how to become better users of the tool. We can solve specific problems that may be poorly understood in our use of the tool. Now, before I get into all that, I will say, I want to hear from you specifically. I want to hear from you about what you like about the podcast, what you don't like about the podcast. So send me an email. My email address is larry@dobusyright.com, and that'll be in the show notes. If you can't think of anything to talk about, then just tell me what your first name is and where you're listening from, and we'll see if we can't strike up a conversation. I'd love to have a relationship with you and understand more about your specific concerns in this area. I know you're interested, or you wouldn't be listening to this podcast, but would like to know more about what specifically brings you here so that I can give you more value, both in the podcast and maybe suggest other ways to deliver value to you around the topic of productivity. So send me an email. So why am I banging on about how we utilize email? And I think it's because it's still new to us. And it's new to us in terms of our society and our social contracts. And I'll talk some about what I mean by that. And we'll define social contracts, and then we'll talk about why they might be important. But first, previously I mentioned Cal Newport, and he talks about email in a different way, but recognizes that it's a huge problem. And the way he talks about it is that email typically represents shadow work. It represents individuals assigning work to each other in an unmanaged sort of a way. And as I mentioned, I think that his point is valid, but we're going to address it from a different perspective here. But I do take his writing on it as an indication that we still need to work on email and similar communication channels such that they're more effective, or at least they don't hurt our effectiveness. The whole point of the tool is to increase our leverage, to increase our productivity. And I think if we are not careful about how we use it, then it may have the opposite effect. And that's certainly Cal's point, is if all we use email for is kind of back channel work assignments, then that's a problem. And we need to address that. So I believe that nobody was really asking for email when it arrived. So it's not like we had this use case, this specific use case that we were saying, hey, fix this for us. You know, if you face a Phillips head screw, then you know the tool you need to solve it, and you can ask for that tool. And then when you get that tool, you more or less understand how to use it. And that's the metaphor here, is that since we weren't really asking for the tool, then it's harder for us to understand how to use it. Now, that doesn't mean it's not welcome. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing in and of itself. It's just a question of understanding the tool such that we can use it terribly well. So I talked a little bit about social contracts. And social contracts are kind of an interesting idea because that has to do with our expectations of each other as we participate in things like communication and as we do things in the world with each other. We have social contracts that we roughly agree to, but that helps us understand our expectations of each other. And I'll give you an example of a social contract. If you have a mail address, a USPS address, and you give that USPS address to governmental entities, then the social contract is they now have the right to expect you to deal with the things that go to that address. I don't know if it's a legal thing. I don't know if you get in trouble for not doing it, but certainly the IRS, for example, is going to send mail to the address that you gave them. And if you have trouble with the IRS saying, I didn't get the letter you sent, is probably a pretty poor excuse. It's going to be viewed as a poor excuse anyway. And so that means that we have this social contract. So simply by having a mailing address, we're contracting with the rest of society to deal with the things that show up legitimately at that physical mailbox address. So that's an example kind of a social contract, and there are many. And I think that they're very important around communication, because if one of the parties breaks the social contract, then that makes communication much more difficult. And this will become more clear as we talk through these examples that I'm going to talk about today. So we have existing social contracts, and we use the items as metaphors. So when you use email, you see an envelope icon quite often. And an envelope definitely is a metaphor for USPS snail mail. But we also know that email is not a letter. It's not USPS, if for no other reason than it's roughly instant delivery. So email is a mashup of these two things and the two metaphors that we have for them. Electronic is instantaneous, mail is some sort of communication, but those metaphors aren't perfect. And particularly when you push them together, they don't really become a whole lot more perfect. They become more complete, but they don't necessarily give you the nuanced understanding. So that's kind of why email is the thing that we're talking about here, although a lot of what we're going to say applies to lots of different modern communication channels, and thus lots of different modern social contracts. And so understanding those social contracts is important. So those two metaphors are based on historical communications. And if we do a mental exercise of thinking, well, 200 years ago, there were only two ways to communicate. It's not true completely, but it's pretty generally true. Most common people 200 years ago either sat down together and had a conversation, or they sent a letter in order to communicate. And there are reasons why you would choose one over the other, and we won't get into all that. But we have long-standing social contracts around these two concepts of conversation and mail or correspondence. And so in email, we tend to think that we can mash those two metaphors, those two social contracts together, and everything will be okay. So the error then, I say error, the challenge of thinking about this needs us to define some terms. So the way I think we should think about this is in terms of synchronous and asynchronous communication. So when we talk about synchronous communication, what we mean is we're communicating together in real time. We're sharing the time. And synchronous has to do with the idea of things happening in an order, and conversation is a back and forth kind of process. And so in conversation, I'll speak for a little while and then I'll stop talking or ask the question, and you'll speak for a little while and we go back and forth. And that's synchronous communication versus asynchronous communication, which is a letter in the mail. You're pretty confident that it's going to get where it's going, but you don't have high confidence in when it's going to get there. But it's not instantaneous. It's not immediate. And so in asynchronous, one part of the process happens and it's expected that the next step in the process will happen, but we don't know when. And so asynchronous is this time-free method of a process happening or an exchange happening. I always think about people who used to play chess by mail. Okay. And so the way that worked is I would write down the move I just made on my board and I would mail that to you, and then you would make that move on my side of your board, and then back and forth we'd go. Highly asynchronous because neither party knows when they're going to be able to make the opponent's next move, if that makes sense. So when we think about that, there are benefits, there are features, if you will, of synchronous communication. And there are features and benefits of asynchronous communication, but they don't necessarily fit together. In some cases, they can conflict. So if we think about synchronous communication is a very rapid exchange of ideas as compared to asynchronous information. Asynchronous information, on the other hand, is really great for long distance communication. It's an inexpensive form of communication in terms of time, effort, etc., unless you get into overnight delivery, but that's another topic. So thinking about synchronous communication and asynchronous communication. So conversation, synchronous. And there are lots of things that are more or less synchronous. I would say that's one of the features of different communication channels is their level of synchronousness, or as the band, The Police, would have you believe, synchronicity. Other synchronous forms or close to synchronous forms of communication. Now, I'll talk about some exceptions to these. A phone conversation is synchronous communication. A Zoom meeting is synchronous communication. But in some ways, both are less synchronous, if you will, than a conversation is in many cases. So then we think about asynchronous correspondence. A letter is certainly asynchronous. which generally maybe is best defined as you know something will happen, but you don't know when with any precision. The initiative in some ways moves back and forth between the two communicating partners. So a key feature of the synchronous kinds of communication that we don't think about a lot, we think about it being fast, but there are two key features of synchronous communication that are not true of asynchronous communication. So one of those features is in synchronous communication, I can tell really well whether or not I have your attention, and vice versa. So in synchronous communication, we typically can observe the other individual and we can detect whether or not we have their attention. And that's a very useful feature of synchronous communication. But it's not one that we think about a whole lot, at least in my experience. Another feature that I think is important that we don't think a lot about, and maybe we think about this one a little more, is in synchronous communication, I can check for understanding roughly in real time. So in synchronous communication, typically face to face, I can say something, and then by paying attention to you, I have cues about whether or not you understood it. And then I can ad lib and change it if I see that you don't understand. And you can ask me questions. Hey, wait a minute, what was that word you used? I'm not familiar with that word. And we can get mutual understanding going more quickly. So those two features of synchronous communication are normally absent from asynchronous communication or correspondence. So conversation has these two features. I can tell whether I have your attention, and I can check whether or not you understand what I said. And then correspondence typically does not have those features in anything like real time. And so when we utilize conversation, we take advantage of those features, right? I can check for understanding. If your attention wanders, I can notice that and acknowledge that in some ways. And so that's the notion of synchronous versus asynchronous communication. And the stereotypical synchronous communication is a conversation. And I'll say for our purposes here, a stereotypical asynchronous communication is correspondence. So there, as we understand these modes, right, and we see the features of these modes, then we can take advantage of them or recognize their absence and use other tools to make sure that our communication is happening effectively. In other words, that the message, the information is being delivered well and clearly. So in the past, typically correspondence it tended to be more thought out, more complete. Typically in a correspondence, different topics are discussed. Different kinds of information fit well on that channel versus other kinds of information that would be better served to be on a synchronous channel, which is times face-to-face conversation. So when we look at email, these two metaphors collide, and in email particularly, as our example. And it's partially because of our experience and the social contracts. So email is an immediately delivered correspondence. And I think when we try to mash those two metaphors together, we can oversimplify their interaction. So these confused social contracts, and by confused social contract, I'll say, well, one of the challenges that we face is we fall into thinking that since email is instant, that it's also synchronous. And so just because a email letter is delivered immediately we tend to think of it as synchronous communication. And we behave in that channel as if it were synchronous communication. But it's not synchronous, because despite the fact that I know that an email will be delivered instantly, there's no guarantee that I'll get your attention instantly. And that's where the correspondence metaphor shows back up. It's like, oh, wait a minute, I got a letter. Well, historically, I didn't think about letters as something that need immediate response because they are a long time in transit. These social contracts then interact. The other thing about email, and if you want to think of it this way, there's another kind of way to phrase it. Email is not mutually instantaneous. It can be instantaneous, but there's no guards against big pauses in the communication. In conversation, there are guards against big pauses. The long silences in conversation tend to be uncomfortable, for example. And so we tend to have some guards against losing that mutual synchronicity or that mutual instantaneous communication. Another challenge of the modes is that quite often, and this is a historical fact as well, but quite often people will pretend to be in synchronous communication, but not be. And so we refer to this as, you're looking at me, are you paying attention to what I'm saying, right? And so in conversation, people's minds wander, there are interruptions, all these different sorts of things. But it's polite for people to pretend to be in synchronous communication. And that's important because it's getting easier to not be in synchronous communication, but pretend to be. And we'll talk about that at some length later. So now we know what synchronous and asynchronous are, and thinking through them a little bit more closely, or maybe some more examples of this. So I suggested it's a spectrum, and face-to-face communication is at or near one end, and correspondence is at or near the other end. And most of our modern communication channels are somewhere in the middle. And I think that this is the impact of a fairly recent innovation of high-speed, long-distance communication. There are examples that go back a century or two, and some, if you study it, they go back even further than that, but they were pretty rare. So when we think about high-speed, long-distance communications, that allows this seemingly synchronous thing to happen. But since it's long distance, in many cases, it loses those two features that we talked about, which is the ability to check for understanding and or the ability to know I have your attention, and vice versa. So one of the keys here is that instantaneous delivery does not guarantee synchronicity. Okay. Roughly instantaneous communication is necessary for synchronicity, but it's not sufficient. Okay. So when we think about email, we think about other modern styles of communication like texting. And texting is, again, instantaneous, but it doesn't guarantee synchronicity. Okay. It's largely asynchronous. Voicemail is a great example, and I'll get into a specific challenge of voicemail here in a minute. But it feels like we're talking to somebody when we leave a voicemail, and we behave as if we were talking to somebody. But those two features of synchronous communication are really not there. And so this is kind of the challenge that we face. And I think that we would be better off to choose a model, a good metaphor for how to use email And that'll help us understand the social contract and thus recognize when the features that we want are there and when they're not, but not allow ourselves to be fooled into thinking that it's one metaphor when in fact it's another. And of course, as I mentioned, there's a spectrum. So synchronous and asynchronous are not bright lines. A conversation, for example, can be synchronous for periods of time and then fall into asynchronous. And in the same way, email can potentially be a synchronous communication or near synchronous communication. But even when it is synchronous, we lose those two features of synchronous communication. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as well. So a specific illustration of one part of this challenge, I mentioned voicemail a minute ago. And voicemail is this really interesting notion of communication. So mentally walk through with me this idea of leaving a voicemail. So we pick up the phone and we dial somebody's number with the intent of having a synchronous communication with them, because we think that our communication warrants synchronous communication, or we just feel the desire for synchronous communication with somebody. And we expect to enter into a synchronous communication, but we don't know for sure that we're going to do that. As compared to, somebody in the room where we start talking, we have a synchronous communication. So the phone rings a few times and we begin to get the idea that this is not going to be a synchronous communication because we have the idea that we're about to leave a voicemail. And when we move through to voicemail, all of a sudden we're thrown into an asynchronous communication. Particularly, we don't know if we have somebody's attention and or when we're going to get it. And we can't check for understanding. So in 4 phone rings, we're thrown from one communication channel or one communication mode, style, whatever word you want to use, into another one. And unsurprisingly, then we tend to not utilize the correct tools for this different communication mode. So we're moving from, our expectation was to have synchronous communication, and we had sort of planned, perhaps to some degree planned, to have asynchronous communication. And now all of a sudden it's like, oops, I'm asynchronous. And what we do is we talk to voicemail as if it were a synchronous channel. So we talk to voicemail as if we were talking to another person. And it's perfectly natural. And it's because we don't recognize, we're not sensitized to the fact that we just moved to an asynchronous channel. So, here now we have a choice. So I had planned asynchronous communication, and now I'm in this asynchronous mode. Well, what do? Well, part of the social contract around the technology of voicemail is that if it's available, I'll leave a voicemail. And you can tell this is the social contract because if you say, hey, I called you yesterday, but you didn't answer, the people will often say, well, but you didn't leave me a voicemail. And so the expectation, the social contract, is that if you get the voicemail, that you'll leave a message. Well, is that the right thing to do in terms of supporting our communication? If we're talking over the phone in a synchronous manner, I can say things like, hey, are you at a place where we could talk? And what I mean by that is, how much of your attention am I going to expect to get here? Well, when I'm leaving a voicemail, I can't know that. I can't know whether or not I have your attention. And what that means among other things, what that means is I'm less confident about delivering complex communications because I can't check for understanding and I don't know that I have your attention. So it becomes really interesting when you think about that, I would say, jarring switch between synchronous communication as planned and asynchronous communication as executed. So again, back to what do I do? Do I break the social contract and not leave a voicemail and switch to another communication channel? Do I quickly replan my conversation and leave a message that's better suited to the asynchronous channel? Or what do I do? And so ideally, we would do what best supports the communication. But what we invariably tend to do is fall back on the social contract. And so I'll leave this amazingly complex voicemail for somebody when in fact the voicemail should probably be much, much simpler. As an example of the challenge of voicemail, I'll refer you to the very first episode that I did on the podcast, which was about your phone is mobile, should your call be? In other words, can you have a reasonable synchronous communication while you're driving your car? And my result of that is most of the time when the phone rings in your car, you should probably just let it go to voicemail and deal with it later. But that's situational. And so there's all kinds of challenges to this mashup in terms of the social convention and in terms of the effectiveness of our communication. So I mentioned there's another specific illustration of the challenge, which I mentioned earlier, and that is that people will pretend to be synchronous because that's polite. In a conversation, it's polite to give your attention to the other individual. And that's, again, the social contract. So, I mentioned that, people pretending to be synchronous. I think this is one of the fundamental issues when we talk about remote work and remote communication, is people pretending to be synchronous with you. I think it has roughly always happened on the phone. So I am eating dinner and the phone rings and maybe I don't have voicemail or maybe I'm expecting a call. And so I stop eating dinner and I take the phone call. Well, it's not the call I was expecting. So I'm not terribly interested in interrupting my dinner. So in addition, I don't want to just hang up on the caller. And so I wind up taking the call and eating dinner at the same time. Well, that's multitasking. Okay, now, is it a critical issue of multitasking? Maybe not, but we get thrown into these situations. And so in that situation, I'll pretend to be on the phone while I'm taking bites of food. I'll pretend that I'm giving my attention when in fact, at best, my attention is split. And we have some ways around this. So a lot of times when we call somebody on the phone and we get them, we'll say, hey, is this a good time to talk? Meaning, of course, as I mentioned before, do I have your attention? At what level do I have your attention? And then on Zoom as well, right? The challenge is when you're on Zoom, you're looking at your computer screen, and there's probably many things that are on your computer screen that can distract you. And so the social contract gets violated. I think that since we're looking at each other, that we're in synchronous communication, but your attention is elsewhere. And in a Zoom meeting, it's somewhat easier to disguise the fact that your attention is elsewhere. The social contract of face-to-face, meaning that I have your attention, fails more frequently in group settings, almost to the point where the fact that I'm looking at you means I have your attention, that conversational social agreement, social contract, just about faded away from meeting settings. It's certainly faded away in the modern university lecture hall. And so I can attest to that firsthand. So this idea that because my students sitting in their seats and me at the podium, because they're looking in my direction, I have their attention, is no longer true. And it's not, sometimes people are still apologetic about that. But with the advent of desktop computers, or I'm sorry, with the advent of laptop computers, all the students have their computer open. And so I've got partial attention. And so beginning to deal with that. Anyway, so this is this notion of the interaction between social contracts and tools and how we use them effectively. Typically, if we're in a face-to-face, one-to-one conversation or in a small group, we can notice when people's attention or when people disengage from synchronous. And there are social structures, communication styles that allow us to politely call that out. And so we'll often do this in conversation. You know, hey, is something else on your mind? You know, help me understand how much of your attention I have. So that's some of the challenges that we face when we're communicating. And I'd say that in many cases, the fact that our modern communication styles are in the middle of this spectrum just adds to the confusion and makes it a little bit harder to understand what style of communication we should engage in. So we've talked about asynchronous communication. So I'll ask you to practice asynchronous communication. Send me an email. So I promise that I will treat it as asynchronous communication if you promise to treat it as asynchronous communication. And I'll look forward to hearing from you. My email address is larry@dobusywright.com, and that's in the show notes. But we can practice our asynchronous communication with each other. Now that we've addressed some of these ideas and done some definitional things and talked about the challenges, I'll give you some of what I think are takeaways from this, and then I'll summarize. When I talk about better communication, of course, what I mean is a clearer message, a clearer transmission of information or a message. I think it's important that we communicate well, that we actually deliver the information that we intend to deliver, or deliver the mental state that we intend to deliver. I think this is a big problem in companies, is our communication is not as good as it could be. And that results in garbled understandings when we think understandings are clear. I'll say whoever initiates the communication has the responsibility to at least start it out well. After all, I have the intent to communicate, which is why I begin the communication. You're a more or less willing recipient of that communication, but it's still my responsibility to communicate as well as I can, which means I need to skillfully use communication channels, because they, as we've seen, they allow different features that I can utilize to make sure communication is happening well. The first takeaway is to begin to learn to choose the right communication mechanism. So we have this stunning variety of ways to communicate with each other. I didn't talk about social media in this podcast, but that's a communication channel. And it has somewhat different features than other communication channels. And so when we choose the communication channel or the communication mechanism, we need to be aware of those features and use them well. And I would say that the set of features matches with the message that needs to be communicated in ways that make that communication more easy or more difficult. So I think the challenge here is that I fall into habit around my default communication channel. And I assume that this is true for lots of people. My kids, for example, their communication habit is text. My communication habit is email. And those two communication channels have different features and thus ask for different styles of communication. I think my children would say I use text because it's synchronous. It's faster than typing out an email. Okay, maybe. But fast may not be what you want in your communication. And certainly believing that because text is instantaneous means that it's also synchronous is, as I've shown before, I think an error. It can be synchronous, but just because it's fast doesn't mean it has to be synchronous. So we need to be careful about choosing the right communication mechanism and thus be careful about our own habit, our own default communication channel, and recognize that what's convenient for me, what's habit for me, may not be the best tool for the job. So we want to choose the communication channel fairly carefully. And we do that by thinking about its rules, which is back to this social contract idea. I would say another takeaway or thing to think about is that most of our channels are actually asynchronous as they are used in practice. And this goes back to the phone call or the Zoom meeting. If I can't guarantee that I have your attention and I can't thus check for understanding, then we might as well then consider that it's an asynchronous channel. And so if it's not clearly asynchronous channel, then we want to think about how this communication can be best done on an asynchronous channel. And that's back to voicemail. So if you're calling somebody and you don't have an appointment to call them, prior to the call, as you're planning asynchronous communication, you may also want to give a thought to, well, what happens if I go to voicemail? If it's an important communication. So if it's not clearly synchronous, then think asynchronous. And if we believe that it's synchronous, then there are ways we can check for that. And again, it's checking for understanding. It's checking for attention. It's watching on a Zoom meeting. If you'll watch people's eyes, and if their eyes are doing this, what I did is I just looked around my computer screen, but you know the thing that I'm talking about. So if it's not clearly synchronous, check for synchronicity. And if you don't get it, then think about asynchronous. And it may be useful to even formally move to an asynchronous channel, a clearly asynchronous channel, so that we engage the other person, the person we're communicating with, we engage them in the correct metaphor. And they understand that it is an asynchronous channel and they treat it as such. I'd say another takeaway, if we're on an asynchronous channel, we probably want to be more planned about what we say, how we communicate. And I'll give an example of this. In real-time phone call, if I need to give somebody information, I can expect them to tell me whether or not they receive that information. So let's say, just for mental clarity, let's say I call somebody up and we're having a synchronous conversation and they ask me for a friend's phone number. And I go, okay, 213-555-1681. I expect that they will slow me down as I deliver it or ask for it again or confirm it back to me if they're not absolutely clear they got it. If I have to leave a voicemail, then I think a good voicemail practice, typically in a voicemail, we would leave our own number. And I'll say it twice. So I'll say, you can reach me at my phone number. Let me repeat that for you. And I'll repeat it again slowly. And that's an acknowledgement of the difference between the two channels. So we build different communication styles on different channels. But on an asynchronous channel, be more careful, more planned, make sure that you use the mechanisms for getting the information across the channel. Or, as I said before, clearly move to a synchronous channel. And this is a challenge that we face in modern communication. Many's the time that I've gotten into a text exchange that needed to move to face because we're clearly not communicating well via the asynchronous remote mechanism of text. So I'll say, I believe we probably need to sit down and have a meeting about this. And I think that'll be the most effective way to communicate. Now, sometimes we preempt ourselves and we know that the topic is likely to be challenging in anything other than a completely synchronous channel. And so we won't even attempt to communicate it unless we're face to face. And this is polite, good manners, obeying the social contract. People interpret social contracts differently, but there is certain categories of information that I will only deliver in a face-to-face communication that's as synchronous as I can keep it. So thinking through and all of these ideas about, and I'll summarize. We talked about synchronous and asynchronous communication. And this is important because many of our modern communication styles, communication channels, are not clearly one or the other. We haven't built social contracts around it. We have habits of use that are in place of social contracts, but there hasn't been enough time for the social contract to be agreed on and managed well. I think that synchronous and asynchronous collide in email because it's an electronic letter. At least that's the way it looks. And so we struggle with using the correct metaphor. And the example of that is that we might think email, because it's immediate, is also synchronous. And we need to think through that. And that's why email is my it is my straw man here, but I think the logic applies to many modern communication channels because of the fact that, as I said, instantaneous long distance communication is a relatively recent idea in our culture, a relatively recent tool in our culture. We did some examples of asynchronous communication, some examples of synchronous communication. We talked about the challenges of not understanding the mode. And the particular example here was when you call somebody planning a synchronous communication and you get thrown into an asynchronous channel voicemail. And the fact that we need to adjust our communication to that asynchronous channel. And then we had some takeaways, the notion that people can pretend to be synchronous, and modern communication styles make that somewhat easier than it has been in the past. Certainly social contracts are changing in the area of face-to-face communication. when I was my kid's age, if I wasn't looking at the person I was talking to, I got hit on the back of the hand with a ruler by my mom. And now it's common for people to be sitting together in the same room at the same table, looking at each other while texting on their mobile devices. So social contracts do change over time, but I think it's a good way to think through these different communication channels. And then we had some takeaways, and I'll recap those. I think the initiator of the communication has a great responsibility in choosing a good channel and matching the communication style to the features of that channel. I think both parties in any sort of a communication exchange should have the right to request a change to a different channel. Typically, that is either communication partner saying, well, I think it's probably best if we have a meeting about this. Clearly moving from, sometimes we'll move from an asynchronous channel to a more synchronous channel. Well, you sent me this email, but I'm going to call you. So we do this some, but I think we need to be fairly careful about doing it more intentionally. And there is some challenge to the social contract around that. But I think it's something that is worth the trouble when we decide to do it. So being careful about the channel, being careful about matching the communication style, in other words, the content to the channel, and then being willing to switch channels when we need to, I think are the primary takeaways here, along with not assuming because communication is instantaneous that it's also synchronous. Again, shoot me an email. Love to hear from you. Larry@dobusywrite.com. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusywrite.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.